Would you turn in your Bibles tonight to 1 Corinthians chapter 9? 1 Corinthians chapter 9. And we have been for a while in the book of 1 Corinthians on Sunday evenings, and we find ourselves tonight in verses 15 through 18, 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Paul here is in a discussion about our rights. And what do we do with disagreements between believers, and what do we do in regards to things that we feel that we deserve? And here in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, of course in chapter 8, he speaks about things that were offered to idols and whether we should eat those things or not, that questionable area. Chapter 9 now, he introduces this idea of the rights that he has as a preacher of the gospel and as an apostle to expect that churches like the church at Corinth would take care of him. And he's addressing that particular right in his own life and how he's going to deal with that. And in doing so, he is emphasizing the fact that as believers, we need to be careful not to be always insisting on our rights, because when we insist on the things that we feel we deserve, this is not a mark of maturity, but rather it is a mark of petty and childish selfishness. Now, we are noted as Americans as those who are demanding of our rights. And many Americans are surprised when they travel to other countries that their constitutional rights don't actually extend with them across international borders. And it can be surprising the way that you get treated sometimes by authorities in other places. And that can be quite a revelation. But here, what Paul is dealing with is between believers, how do we deal with one another, especially when there's differences or with disagreements. Now, in the first 14 verses of 1 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul has taken great pains to lay out a case for why a preacher of the gospel should live of the gospel. Why those who are the recipients of his teaching and preaching ministry should be a part of taking care of his needs. We spent a great deal of time on that 2 Sunday nights ago. I'm not going to re-preach that message. But in the first 14 verses, Paul is laying out a case for why a church should care for those who are involved in teaching and preaching to them the Word of God. Now in these verses 15 through 18, which we're going to take as our text tonight, Paul is going to set aside the entire argument which he has laid out, and he is now going to say, in spite of that, in spite of the biblical case that I have for churches like the church at Corinth to support me, I have put aside that right so that I might serve others with the gospel. Paul wanted to serve others by preaching the gospel, and Paul did not want anyone to think that he was doing what he was doing in order to receive an offering. Primarily, Paul was dealing with this because he was no longer at Corinth, and he wanted to address this issue for the sake of those who were then teaching and preaching in Corinth. But he could say with a clear conscience, this is not what I insisted on when I was there preaching the gospel. So direct your attention, if you would, to verse number 15. We'll read the text tonight, 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 15 through 18, and then we'll dig right into the message tonight, which I've titled, Freely Preach the Gospel. Verse 15 says, But I have used none of these things, neither have I written these things that it should be so done unto me. For it were better for me to die than that any man should make my glorying void. For though I preach the gospel, I have nothing to glory of, for necessity is laid upon me. Yea, woe is unto me if I preach not the gospel. For if I do this thing willingly, I have a reward. But if against my will, a dispensation of the gospel is committed unto me. What is my reward then? Verily that, when I preach the gospel, I may make the gospel of Christ without charge, that I abuse not my power in the gospel. Now note, as Paul speaks about his attitude in preaching the gospel, and I'm going to posit this evening that these verses are the type of attitude that every believer ought to have and that every preacher of the gospel ought to have, and that is, whether I get paid or not, I'm going to preach the gospel. I remember speaking with Brother Harper one time about this, and he and I are good friends, and he said to me, you know, brother, it doesn't matter where I'm at, and it doesn't matter whether I get a paycheck for doing it or not. I know this, I have been called to preach the gospel, and wherever I am and whatever I get for it, I'm going to preach the gospel because Christ has called me to do that. And I just appreciate that spirit that he had, and that ought to be the spirit of every true man of God. Paul had the attitude that the gospel should be freely preached. Some people have the attitude, you know, churches, all they talk about is money. All they're interested in is offerings and tithes. And I will be quick to say tonight that the way that we worship the Lord with our tithes and offerings is not an insignificant matter. It's not something to excuse or to overlook. And I do believe tonight that a church that is obedient to God in the area of the tithes and offerings is going to be a church that experiences the blessing of God. At the same time, there's not a one of us that ought to get the attitude, especially those who are involved in the work of the ministry, that we do this professionally or for a paycheck. But rather, we do this because of the call of God on our lives. And that's exactly the sentiment that Paul is expressing here in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Would you notice with me, first of all, that Paul expresses the fact that he has sacrificed to preach the gospel. He says in verse 15, after laying out a very clear case from the Old Testament about why a preacher should be paid to do what they're doing by those who are the recipients of his teaching and preaching ministry, Paul says in verse 15, but I have used none of these things. Now, Paul was careful to say, I've presented these arguments to you, but I want you to know that I have never asked for an offering from anyone, and especially I have not asked for an offering from the church at Corinth. Now, it seems that there were some of Paul's detractors in the church at Corinth, and some who were accusing Paul of some things. And one of the accusations that they were making was, Paul, you've just done this for your profit. You've done this so that you can take advantage. You've done this so that you could make some money. And Paul was able to say with a clear conscience, I have not used the scriptural basis that I have presented to you to claim for people to take care of me, but rather I have trusted God to care for my needs. We know that Paul had even worked a secular job in order to care for his needs and the needs of those who traveled with him. And so Paul could say, I have done none of these things. I have used none of these things. In verse 15, he also goes on and he says, neither have I written these things that it should be so done unto me. You know, one of the things that can be leveled against a preacher is if he preaches about money, people say he's just interested in what he can get for himself. And so Paul addressed that here, and he said, I didn't write these things so that I could get an offering from you. I wasn't looking for any generosity from you. I wasn't looking for you to send something to me. I said these things so that I could now present to you my case that I have willingly laid aside my rights, my scriptural rights to something in order to serve you and to show you my love and care for you. Paul's purpose in writing was not to get an offering. He had a completely different purpose in what he was writing to the church at Corinth. In verse 15, then he goes on and he says, for it were better for me to die than that any man should make my glorying void. Now, Paul was so passionate about his purpose and that which compelled him to preach the gospel. And he was speaking here in this sense that he would rather die than have the wrong motivation for preaching the gospel. He didn't want to get caught up in some sort of a system where he was working in order to get a paycheck. And, you know, that can be a danger for a man who's in the ministry, we would say, in a professional way. That is, that he's paid for what he does, that he would begin to maybe mitigate or to change the message in order to help the offerings and to get things, to be more pleasing for his salary package, and these types of temptations exist. And so Paul says, I would rather die than to lose the basis of my glorying. And we're going to see that his glorying was in the gospel of Christ. You see, Paul was so passionate about the gospel that he saw his preaching of the gospel as a life or death matter. Now, I want to ask you a question tonight as we think about that concerning the Apostle Paul. Do you see the preaching of the gospel as a life or death matter? That it is so serious that you be involved in preaching the gospel to those who are around you that you would rather die than not preach the gospel. That's a compulsion, isn't it? That is a strong passion. And that's exactly how I believe we ought to feel about preaching the gospel. Paul said, I'm willing to sacrifice. I'm willing to give in order to preach the gospel. At the end of verse 15, he says, then that any man should make my glorying void. And here Paul is demonstrating how very careful we need to be about our motivations in the service of the Lord. Sometimes, even in the work of the ministry, even in sharing the gospel on visitation and things like that, we can fall into a pattern of wrong motivations, can't we? We start falling into, well, what do people think about me? And I know that pastor might ask for a testimony, and so I want to have a testimony so that people know that I'm a witness. Or I want to be able to tell people, I've been sharing the gospel with someone, and we can fall into that sort of a mentality. Sometimes as those who are in full-time service, those who get paid, in other words, to be involved in the ministry, they can think, well, I need to do this because this is my job and that's what I get paid to do. And that's the wrong motivation. Paul said, I would rather die than that my glorying would be made void. In other words, that he was so intent on having the right motivation for preaching the gospel. Paul gloried in the gospel being freely preached. You do know that much of the world believes that the reason we preach the gospel is to get something from them, don't you? You do realize that. And they're mystified, like the young man that Brother Gable talked to who said, you would come to my house and do a Bible study? Why would you do something like that? Almost implying, are you asking for something? Is there going to be an offering at the end? Are you going to pass the offering plate at the Bible study? Is there going to be some kind of an expectation that I'm going to have to do something in response to that? And people in the world are not really prepared when you say, I want to do that because I love you, because I care about you, and because God cares about you. But listen, that's the reason that we ought to be sharing the gospel. That's the reason that we ought to be preaching the gospel. The gospel was freely given to you and I, and we ought to freely give the gospel to those who are around us. One of the reasons, and many of you know that we have a television program on Sunday mornings at 10:30 on Channel 69. And sometimes people will ask me, who watch that program, not folks from here, but people who I run into, and they'll say, why don't you ever ask for offerings, or why don't you ever ask for people to send in money? And one of the reasons that I feel so strongly about never asking for money on that television program is because that is what the world expects. The world expects that all religious programming is for the purpose of soliciting funds. And we want people to know the gospel is freely being preached. The gospel is freely given to us. Now, does it cost us some money to have that television program? Absolutely it does. But our mission, our purpose is to preach the gospel and to spread it to the regions beyond. And we ought to preach the gospel freely. Paul sacrificed to preach the gospel. Now, I want you to understand this evening that if you're going to be involved in preaching the gospel, it's going to take some sacrifice on your part. If you're always looking for, what am I going to get out of it? What recognition am I going to get out of it? What kind of remuneration am I going to get out of it? What kind of a paycheck am I going to get out of it? Or, that's for the people who get paid to do that. You've got entirely the wrong focus, because if you are a believer and the gospel has been given to you, that is the greatest gift that you've ever received. And in the same way that it was freely given to you, you ought to freely give the gospel to others. Paul's sacrifice to preach the gospel. But then in verse 16, we find Paul continuing to expound on this. And he says there, and this is a very well-known verse, he says, for though I preach the gospel, I have nothing to glory of. For necessity is laid upon me, yea, woe is unto me if I preach not the gospel. And so I want you to see, second of all, not only Paul's sacrifice to preach the gospel, but Paul's necessity to preach the gospel. Paul is stating very clearly in verse 16, I must preach the gospel. There is not an option for me to check the box, I'm not going to preach the gospel today. Now notice what he says in verse 16, for though I preach the gospel. Now it's clear enough from Paul's testimony and from Paul's presence at the church at Corinth that Paul preached the gospel. Would you agree with that? Paul preached the gospel. Anybody who knew Paul or knew anything about Paul said Paul is about preaching the gospel. But we see accounts of him in Acts chapter 17. He ends up in Athens all by himself without anybody to be there as a witness who is on his missions team. He's waiting for Timothy to join him there in Athens. And while he's there, the Bible says that his heart was stirred within him when he saw the people given to much idolatry. And Paul said, I've got to preach the gospel in this place. We see him, he couldn't even sit still for a couple of days. He's out in the marketplace preaching the gospel, reasoning with people about the resurrection, pointing them to Jesus Christ. It's clear enough that Paul was someone who was passionate about preaching the gospel. Now, sometimes we think, and Paul is expressing here when he says, though I preach the gospel, I have nothing to glory of. We sometimes think, well, you know, the people, the Christians who actually share the gospel, they're the exemplary Christians. They're the extra committed Christians. They're the ones who are a cut above the average Christian or the normal Christian. Think about this with me tonight. God's plan is for a normal disciple of Christ to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. God's plan is for every single believer who is sitting here tonight to be passionate and to be pursuing the preaching of the gospel. We all ought to be involved in this pursuit. And Paul says, for though I preach the gospel, I have nothing to glory of. There is no glory that we can take in preaching the gospel. Tonight, these who gave testimonies, I trust they didn't give those testimonies for the purpose of saying, look at me, I'm sharing the gospel, but rather to say, what a blessing that the grace of God is evident in my life, that He's used me in this way. All glory goes to God. Think about this. If we preach the gospel, what have we accomplished actually? Well, we've done our duty, right? We've done our duty. We would think, as if you were to go to a restaurant and there was a cook in the back and the cook was in the kitchen and the cook was cooking food. That's to be expected, right? Are you all following me? You stop by the kitchen. Thank you for doing your job today. Woo, man, you're something. Probably not. I mean, I'm sure you appreciate the guy cooking or the gal cooking, but they're getting paid to do it, right? And so you would expect if they're in the kitchen as a cook that they would be cooking, and it doesn't seem like it would be something that's above and beyond the call of duty. Where did we get the idea that sharing the gospel is like extra credit assignment for the Christian life? That, that's for the people who are really committed. Those who are really committed, they share the gospel. No, every one of us should be sharing the gospel. In fact, in Luke chapter 17 and verse 10, Jesus said this, so likewise ye, when ye shall have done all those things which are commanded you, say, we are unprofitable servants. We have done that which was our duty to do. At the end of the day, if we share the gospel with thousands upon thousands of people, what have we done more than our duty? We've just done what God has commanded us to do. You and I are nothing more than unprofitable servants, and we're doing nothing more than that which is expected and required of us as servants of Christ. And this is what Paul is saying in verse 16. He says, for though I preach the gospel, I have nothing to glory of. It's not as if I can pat myself on the back and say, look at me, I'm a super Christian, I share the gospel. I'm just doing what Christ has commanded me to do. I'm just doing that which I'm obligated to do. He goes on in verse 16, and he says, for necessity is laid upon me, yea, woe is unto me if I preach not the gospel. Now that phrase, necessity is laid upon me, means that this necessity or this necessary thing is a constant responsibility. So that idea of being laid upon him, if you could picture like a weight on your back that's constantly pressing against you, that's the idea that Paul is giving to us. And he says the gospel and my responsibility to preach the gospel is constantly pressing against me. It's laid upon me. It's something that is always present in my mind. I am always on call. I am always on the job. I am always to be busy about my Father's business. And sometimes we think, well, as long as I've gone to weekly visitation, or as long as I've attended the weekly services, then I can check my box off and I've done what God has asked me to do. Have you ever noticed how most good witnessing opportunities come at the most inopportune times? Like when we're off duty and we're not supposed to be on duty. We're not actually on visitation. We're not actually expecting to have an opportunity. And just like that, God opens the door. And do you ever think, but this is my free time, Lord. This is time when I'm supposed to be doing something else. And Paul said this, necessity is laid upon me. No matter what Paul did or where Paul went, the responsibility to preach the gospel was always pressing on him. I want to say this tonight as we consider verse 16. If you and I had this attitude that Paul had, I guarantee you we would have more witnessing opportunities than we presently do. Because I believe this with all my heart, God is working in more lives than we have ever imagined. Sometimes we look at people and we think, well, they're closed off to the gospel. They're hard to the gospel. They're not going to be receptive, not knowing what is actually going on in their life. Not knowing that God is actually at work in their life and they have some curiosity. Now, they may not open up to us. They may not share with us what is going on. But the reason that necessity is laid upon me to preach the gospel is because God is always at work. Now, I ask you this question tonight. Where did this necessity come from? For Paul, why was it necessary and why was necessity laid upon him to preach the gospel? Well, because the gospel had been freely given to him, and because the gospel had so dramatically changed his life, Paul was obligated to share the gospel with others who had not yet heard the gospel. I think that Paul could go back in his mind, and he could remember what it was to be a persecutor of Jesus Christ and of the church of Jesus Christ, breathing out threatenings and slaughter, and yet in his heart, I believe this, Saul of Tarsus was sincere in what he was doing. He really felt that he was serving God. But God got his attention on the road to Damascus. Jesus Christ knocked him off of his horse and alerted him. And as Brother Merrick made reference to last week, I believe that the testimony of Stephen at his stoning had lodged in Saul's heart, and he was confronted with the truth of the gospel, and Saul of Tarsus became Paul the Apostle. Saul of Tarsus, the persecutor of the churches of Christ, became a preacher of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And Paul says as much. As he looked at his past and he realized what he had been given, he said, how could I not preach the gospel? How could I not share with others what was shared with me? How could I not show others how their lives could be changed in the same way that my life was changed? I present to you tonight, how could you not present and preach the gospel to others around you when you have benefited so greatly from the gospel? When the gospel has changed your life, you and I have a necessity to preach the gospel, an obligation to preach the gospel. In fact, Paul goes so far in verse number 16 as to say, woe is unto me if I preach not the gospel. Now that word woe is a word of extreme grief and sorrow. And Paul says this, sorrow would be upon him, mourning would be upon him if he preached not the gospel. Now, some Christians say, well, it doesn't bother me to not preach the gospel. I'm going to say something to you tonight, and I want you to carefully consider this. One day, it will bother you. One day, when you look upon your Savior and you realize the opportunities that you have squandered, it will matter. It will be something that will bring grief. It will be something that will bring sorrow. You say, well, I thought that there were no tears in heaven. Well, you read it carefully, the Bible actually says there's coming a time when God will wipe the tears away from our eyes. And we are told that there is a judgment seat. We are told that there will be some sorrow at that judgment seat. And so Paul says this, be careful. I'm careful because woe is unto me if I preach not the gospel. Now, I think it's true tonight that not only in heaven, but also here on the earth, it is true that a Christian who refuses to preach the gospel to others will never really know the joy of the Lord. You know, some of the most joyous times in my life are when I am stepping out by faith and preaching the gospel to people around me and seeing, I can't believe it. God is at work. I can hardly believe it. I talked to that person and I had no idea, and here they're telling me about what God has been doing in their life. And you know, that gets me excited. Listening to these testimonies tonight, I'm listening to these things and I'm saying, God is at work. I mean, it's wonderful to be a part of God's work in this world. And I believe great joy comes to us when we recognize what God is up to and the part that God has asked us to play in that as ambassadors for Christ. So Paul says this, it's necessary for me to preach the gospel. We could go further and say, if we are not fulfilling that necessity, we are not being obedient servants of Christ. And so Paul says it's necessary. He sacrificed to preach the gospel. I believe you and I will need to sacrifice to preach the gospel. We'll need to sacrifice our time and our talents. We'll need to sacrifice maybe some money. We'll need to sacrifice some pursuits. We'll need to sacrifice, we'll need to even sacrifice here in the church and put aside some things that we could do together as a church family, which are not necessarily facilitating the preaching of the gospel so that we can pursue the preaching of the gospel. Because evangelism is what God has called us to do. It's necessary that we preach the gospel. As a New Testament church, if we're not preaching the gospel, are we really fulfilling our purpose? Are we doing what God has put us here for? The answer to that is no, in case you didn't realize. And so Paul says there's a necessity to preach the gospel. He sacrificed to preach the gospel. But now notice in verses 17 and 18, Paul refers to a reward. Now remember, in the context, Paul, he's established this argument. The preacher, those who minister the word, should be taken care of by those who benefit from that ministry. Those who preach the gospel should live of the gospel, and that's a principle that's established in those verses. But now Paul has said, but I've not taken advantage of that. I've not asked for that. I've not expected that. I've not even received that. So what was it that Paul was working for? Well, he says in verse 17, for if I do this thing willingly, I have a reward. But if against my will a dispensation of the gospel is committed unto me, what is my reward then? Verily that, when I preach the gospel, I may make the gospel of Christ without charge, that I abuse not my power in the gospel. Now think carefully with me. We're going to work through these two verses phrase by phrase, and I hope I don't lose you tonight. First of all, Paul says this, if I do this thing willingly, I have a reward. Once again, Paul is bringing to our attention how important it is that we have the right attitude in our service to the Lord. Paul says, look, if I serve the Lord willingly, then there is a reward that is stored up for me. So Paul is looking at the sacrifice. He's looking at what he is given to preach the gospel, but then he's also holding that up against the promised reward, and he's saying the sacrifice pales in comparison to the reward that God has in store for me. You all following what he says? As long as I'm doing this thing willingly, as long as I'm being obedient to the Lord, as long as I have the right motivation, it's voluntary. He's saying I'm preaching voluntarily. I've not been forced. I'm not doing this for money. I'm not doing this for some kind of recognition. I'm doing this to please the Lord and to fulfill my calling. And if I do this thing willingly, I have a reward. Now, sometimes people say it's not right to speak about heavenly rewards. And so the question is, then why did God speak about it? If it wasn't right to speak about it, then why would God tell us that there are heavenly rewards? And we see many mentions about the fact that there are heavenly rewards. It's not right to serve for earthly rewards, but it is right to serve for heavenly rewards. And Paul had his focus on something, and he said, I can do this willingly because of my anticipation of a reward. But then he admits in verse 17, and maybe you can admit with him, that his heart isn't always in it. Do you all ever struggle with that? Maybe visitation time comes. Brother Gable was so honest and he confessed to us he didn't feel like coming to visitation. Now, he's not very spiritual, and I'm sure he's going to get right with God tonight. He's going to repent of that. And I imagine that none of you have ever felt that way. Right. Actually, all of us know exactly what that feels like. In fact, for some of us, we may feel like that every single time we go on visitation. We may think, why in the world am I here? Nobody listens. Nobody cares. I don't know why I'm doing this. But you know what? Here's what Paul says. Okay, if I'm not even doing it willingly, if I do it willingly, I get a reward. Okay, But if not, if it's against my will, so I'm being forced, if you will, he says I'm put in a position where I have to, or where I need to preach the gospel. If against my will, here's what he says, a dispensation of the gospel is committed unto me. Now that word dispensation is very interesting. It literally means a stewardship or an administration. And so it'd be like this. If I said to Sam, here's $20,000, he'd like that. But Sam, I have a very specific purpose for this $20,000. I want you to invest it, and I want you to use it in this specific way, and I'm giving you power over that money for this purpose. Okay, so suppose that he took that money and we drew up a legal contract, a legal document, and there was things, where he signed and I signed. And then let's say he took that $20,000 and he said, you know what? I've been wanting to buy some hot dogs. And I've been thinking about going on a shopping spree. And I've always wanted to go to the islands of the Caribbean in the winter. And all of a sudden, next thing he knows, $20,000 is gone. You know what? Because that's a stewardship and because we entered into a legal contract, I would have the right to go after him for that money and to say, you agreed to use that money for a specific purpose. You see what I'm saying? It's a stewardship. It's a dispensation. It's an administration for a very specific purpose. The gospel is a dispensation that is given to believers. It is a stewardship. It is something that God gives to us not to squander on ourselves, but to share with the world. And here's what Paul says, if I can't do it willingly, if it's against my will, then I know this, I am obligated to preach the gospel because this is a stewardship. The gospel does not belong to me. Do you understand this tonight? The gospel does not belong to me. The gospel does not belong to you. The gospel does not even belong to Lehigh Valley Baptist Church. The gospel belongs to the Lord Jesus Christ. He has given it to us as a stewardship, and He has said, use it wisely. You see, it's not yours or mine to change the gospel. The gospel is not yours or mine to charge for receiving. That's one of the reasons that when we receive offerings here as a church, we make sure that people know this is a free will offering. This is between you and God. There's not going to be a bill coming to your house to say this is how much you owe. There's not going to be a sense that when you walk through the door, we're going to check your tithing dues and make sure that you're paid up. This is between you and God. Why? Because the gospel is not mine to charge for. The gospel belongs to God. The gospel is His. And Paul says this, if my heart's not in it, then I still need to preach the gospel. Did you know that? If your heart's not in it, you still have to preach the gospel. Fellas, this is a lot like you go to work. I'll bet there's some days when you go to work and you really enjoy your job. And you enjoy, at least I hope so, and you enjoy the things that you do, and you enjoy some of the people you interact with, and you get some satisfaction from that task. And of course, you enjoy getting the reward at the end of that, the money that comes from it. But I'll bet there's some days that you get out of bed, and maybe you don't even get out of bed. Maybe you're just laying in bed, and you're thinking, I don't want to go to work today. I'm going to suspect tomorrow is going to be a day like that after daylight savings time. And you're thinking, I don't really want to go to work, and I don't feel much like it. Now, on days like that, why do you get up and go to work anyway? Assuming that you do. Why? Okay, you need to get a paycheck. And why do you need to get a paycheck? Because of bills, right? Because if you don't go to work, if you lay in your bed enough days in a row, the bill collector is going to come calling and knocking. And all of a sudden, things are going to start snowballing. And you're going to realize, oh, wait, I have to go to work because I have obligations. Here's what Paul says. Look, the gospel is something that has been given to me. Whether I feel like it or not, I need to preach the gospel. Now, this is so significant because I find that a lot of Christians, myself included, are waiting for some kind of a holy unction from God, meaning they're waiting to feel like it to preach the gospel. I'm going to tell you this evening, there's going to be a lot of times you are not going to feel like preaching the gospel. There's going to be a lot of times because of fear, because of impatience, because of skepticism, because of you fill in the blank, you are not going to feel at all like preaching the gospel. But God doesn't ask us to preach the gospel when we feel like it, does He? He says, preach the gospel. Preach the gospel whether you feel like it or not. It's a stewardship. It's a dispensation that has been presented to you. What would you think of an employee who is given resources to do a job and then refused to do their job because they didn't feel like it? If you were their boss, what would you do? You'd fire them. You'd fire them. Maybe you would reprimand them first, but eventually you'd say, look, this isn't working out. You can't just come and collect a paycheck and do nothing in return. You are expected to do a job, and either you're going to do the job or you're going to go find another job. We all understand that, don't we? In the same sense, we have an obligation to Jehovah God to preach the gospel. It's a dispensation that is committed to us, and you and I are guilty of misusing the gospel when we take it for ourselves and we refuse to share it with others. Did you get that? We are guilty of misusing the gospel when we take it for ourselves and refuse to share it with others. Paul said, if against my will, a dispensation of the gospel is committed unto me. In verse 18, he asks this question, what is my reward then? Okay, what is the reward that I have? What is the reward that Paul could expect for preaching the gospel? What is his pay? That word reward literally means what are my wages? Most of you, when you go to work, you like to know what you're working for. And so if they say you're going to be earning $12 an hour, then you can expect after you've worked 40 hours that you're going to get $480 minus taxes. Oh yeah, we forgot about that. Okay, so you'll get about $25. Anyway, just kidding. You'll get your paycheck, and you expect, I worked, I get paid. Do you know that when you preach the gospel, there is a reward? There are wages. There is a paycheck that God is going to give to us. And Paul says, what are my wages? What is my reward? What is my remuneration for gospel work? Is there a reward tonight that you and I can expect if we preach the gospel? Paul says that there is. And specifically in verse 18, he says something about what that reward is. Now, think about this. He says in verse 18 that the reward is that when I preach the gospel, I may make the gospel of Christ without charge. So literally, his reward was the satisfaction of knowing that he preached the gospel without charging for it. And he had the reward of saying, I know that when I preach the gospel, I did it with the right motive. I didn't do it to get something out of anyone. I did it to be obedient to the Lord. And to me, the reward of me preaching the gospel is a clear conscience before God. Now, Paul is not saying in verse 18 that those who preach the gospel should never be paid. He's not saying that. In fact, he's already gone to great pains, hasn't he, in the first 14 verses to establish that it's actually normal for those who receive the ministry of the gospel to share in the expenses or to help the people who are preaching the gospel. And so there's not a problem with that. But rather, what Paul is saying is this: my motivation has to be right. I remember my dad saying to me many times through the years, son, if God has called you to preach, you'll preach whether anybody gives you a paycheck or not. And that's true. That's true. If somebody says, I'll preach if I get a paycheck, then I say, you're probably not called to preach because you don't seem to understand the call to preach. Now think about this. Let's take it a little bit further and let's say sharing the gospel. Well, I'll share the gospel if I get recognized in church. I'll share the gospel if I can win some kind of a contest. I'll share the gospel and fill in the blank. Then you've got the wrong attitude. You've got it all mixed up. You see, our reward is found in having the right motivation for the preaching of the gospel. A man who is called of God will preach at every opportunity that is afforded to him. And I believe that a Christian should likewise be willing to preach the gospel whether they receive praise or not, whether or not people receive the message. Maybe you've heard this before. Well, you know, I would be involved in evangelism, but nobody really listens in our country anymore. Have you ever heard that? I used to go on visitation, but that was back when people used to listen. And so I'm not interested in doing that anymore because people here just don't listen. Well, that's an unscriptural attitude. God didn't say go preach the gospel if people will listen. In fact, we have a lot of scriptural examples where he said go and preach the gospel to people who will not listen, to people who are going to plug their ears. Go ahead and preach to them because that's your obligation, that's your stewardship. Our reward for preaching the gospel is not administered by people, it's administered by Jesus Christ himself. Now, Paul is careful to say in verse 18 that he did this so that I abuse not my power in the gospel. You see, Paul's power, his authority or his dominion was in the gospel to expect that those who heard and received the gospel would help to take care of his physical needs. Certainly, Paul had physical needs. Preachers eat. They do. Some of them eat more than others. But Paul certainly had to eat. Paul needed a place to live. Paul needed some basic expenses met. And he had the right, according to the scriptures, to expect that people would provide for those needs. But he said this, I want to be careful not to abuse my authority, my power in the gospel. Paul wanted to be very careful about insisting that someone pay him for preaching the gospel. Paul did not want to be accused of preaching the gospel for profit. So because of this, Paul went the extra mile to provide for his own needs while he was at the church at Corinth. While he was in the city of Corinth, he didn't ask for anything. He didn't demand anything. He didn't receive anything because they never put it together that they needed to take care of his needs. He diligently worked making tents. He diligently worked preaching the gospel, and as a result, his needs were met and the needs of those who labored with him, and he did not receive anything from the church at Corinth. Therefore, he could stand back and say to them, I've not received anything from you. I should have, and it would have been right for me to expect that, but I want you to know that I freely preached the gospel to you. Sometimes, it's amazing to me, sometimes people will when I am involved in doing a Bible study or something with someone, people out in the world understand this, right? And so you do a Bible study with someone, and sometimes they'll say, now, what can I give to you for doing this Bible study with me? And I'll say to them, every time I say, you don't need to give me anything for doing this Bible study with you. I'm doing this because I care about you and because I want you to hear the truth. The gospel is free. I'm not charging you anything for that. And you know, for many people, it almost blows their mind. How can you not be charging? You're coming and spending all this time with me. You're answering these questions for me. You're showing me things from the Bible. How can you not charge for that? You know what? We need to preach the gospel freely. We need to distribute the gospel freely. We need to give that out to people so that they can come to the knowledge of the truth. Paul said, I do not abuse my power in the gospel. So Paul wanted us to understand the gospel needs to be freely preached. Let's not allow the desire for a reward, whether that is a paycheck or the recognition of men, let's not allow the desire for a reward to get in the way of us preaching the gospel. Let's make sure that our motivation is clean, that our motivation is pure. Let's make sure that we're willing to sacrifice to preach the gospel. Let's feel the weight of that necessity, that stewardship that we have to preach the gospel, and let's anticipate the reward that God has laid up in store for us for preaching the gospel. Now tonight, as we think about this, and we've heard some testimonies earlier, and now we've looked at this passage of Scripture, and I ask you this tonight, are you preaching the gospel? Are you preaching the gospel? Maybe tonight you say, well, Pastor, I haven't been preaching the gospel. Can I ask you this evening, what is holding you back from preaching the gospel? Could you try to identify the thing that is keeping you from preaching the gospel? Now, some people will offer, okay, I'm afraid. I'm afraid. And that is an excuse that many of us struggle with, and that we can find some scriptural ways to deal with. Some people say, well, I don't know what to say. I just wouldn't know what to say to someone if I was going to preach the gospel. And you know, that's something that can be dealt with. Some people say, well, I just don't have time. And I think you could probably find time to preach the gospel. You know, you need to deal with the excuse that is in your mind and say, why am I not preaching the gospel? Why am I not sharing the gospel with others? Lord, help me to surrender that area to you, because necessity is laid upon us. We must preach the gospel of Jesus Christ to those who are around us. Tonight, we're going to have a different kind of an invitation. We're not going to have any music, and we're going to just ask you to sit where you're at tonight. And I want you to take just a few minutes for reflection upon the message. And second of all, I want you to take just a couple of minutes to pray to the Lord and ask the Lord to identify for you what it is that is holding you back from diligently preaching the gospel the way that you ought. A second thing I want you to ask the Lord is, Lord, give me someone. Perhaps the Lord even tonight would bring someone to your mind, a name, an individual, someone that He would bring to your attention. And tonight, not only ask God to show you the obstacle to evangelism, the thing that is keeping you from preaching the gospel like you know you ought to, but second of all, ask God to show you someone and say, Lord, give me an opportunity to preach the gospel to them in the next several days. Open the door of opportunity so that I can share Christ with them. So we're going to take just a few minutes. I'll come back in just a couple minutes here and dismiss us in prayer. But I want you to think about these things and talk to the Lord about them during this time of invitation.